it is clearly the farmers who need to lead the conversation. They are the ones who are experimenting every day on their farms with their actions and with their economy, putting their economies on the line to test out and to develop and adapt regenerative techniques to their reality and to their context. So they're the ones who can say what regenerative agriculture is without a doubt. For us, this is totally clear.
This is Regenerative Skills, the podcast helping you to learn the skills and solutions to create an abundant and connected future. I'm your host, Oliver Gaucher. So hey everybody, and welcome to the second episode of the 10th season of the Regenerative Skills podcast. Now, as I mentioned in the last episode, there are a lot of changes this year. The main ones being that we're reducing the frequency to 2 episodes a month, and I'll be using 2 primary formats. The first one is the panel sessions that have become really popular over the last 2 years, where I interview 3 people with different perspectives around a topic that is central to the discussions of the climate farmers community. And the second one is what we're kicking off today, which I'm calling deep dive episodes. The intention behind these is to bring complexity back into the conversations around regenerative agriculture. Myself and many of my peers have been observing the discourse online, and especially on social media, devolve into these catchphrases and buzzwords with little meaning. And I want to embrace the complexity and the many perspectives around all of the topics that get debated online. We'll be testing out a mix of investigative journalism, key interview snippets, and narrative weaving, not to assert a single stance on any issue, but rather to guide listeners through the fact that there are rarely any easy answers, and that there's so much more to these conversations than the oversimplified arguments that we gloss over on clickbait titles and polarizing debates. So to get us started, today in our deep dive, we're going to be taking on the subject of who gets to say what regenerative means. Obviously, this is a question that's going to provoke some controversy, and there are many different perspectives, not only on who gets to define it, but also what the definition itself is. And for that reason, I want to preface this by saying that instead of making a strong declaration to answer the question, I want to invite you to sit with the complexity and work to consider the motivations and the agendas of any actor working to assert a definition that they might have. We're going to move away from the binary, the black or white, the good or the bad conclusions. And I would actually be glad if by the end of this episode, you're left with more questions and even more uncertainty. We here want to embrace the ongoing conversations that this provokes, and we have various platforms on which we engage with these discussions. So if you're an active farmer anywhere in Europe, you can join the Climate Farmers community for free through our website at climatefarmers.org and share your thoughts in the group there. And for anybody else, I'll be advancing these topics on LinkedIn, both through my personal profile and the Climate Farmers page. Now, as a preface to my approach to tackling this tricky question, I've leaned on a diverse set of voices from my personal network that are particularly relevant to my own experience and to the European context, but by no means do they represent all of the differing opinions and ways of looking at the central question today. But I'll talk about that by the end, and we're also going to expand on the question in the next episode as well. So to kick this off, let's get started by hearing from 2 good friends of mine and farmers in central Portugal about how they see this question of who defines what regeneration is.
Hello, everybody. My name is João Valente.
I am Diogo Pinho.
João is the owner of Monte Silveira, outside of Castelo Branco, and Diogo heads the R&D activities of the farm, as well as coordinating certification processes, educational events, and many other activities. Together with their team, they manage over 700 hectares and produce a wide variety of crops, from arable crops, mixed livestock, olives, compost, and more. They're the first large-scale farm to achieve regenerative organic certification in Portugal, and they have a unique way of looking at the value of certification.
I think Diogo and I have the same opinion. We are not like this war guys that we should not have it, that guy should have it. But I think that obviously the market it's like a monkey. It likes to jump from trend to trend and to take advantage of several trends. For me personal, you should at minimum be an organic producer to get the regenerative organic certification. because there's a lot of people that is taking advantage. Like they start to do just a no-till and then say, okay, I have jumped into regenerative agriculture because I don't till the soil, and they don't understand all the other complex aspects that even myself don't understand. I'm using the words of Nicole Masters. It's a never-ending journey. At least, I think that what me and Yogo think, it's you need to be humble all the time. In Europe, people care a lot about like seeing the stamp and what they are buying, and differentiate ourselves from other operators. And because we believe in our project that it's very hard. I don't say that we cannot change policymakers, but we know that policymakers are driven by money. Everybody's driven by money. So money it's what like controls them. So we want to go directly to the consumer, because if you change the mindset of the consumer, then you can change policy. So we need that validation so that consumer can choose when he goes to a supermarket or to the website. I said, no, I want this because they have this stamp and they have to pass so many barriers and they really like deserve this stamp and I choose for this. And then obviously with that consumer changing his mind, he can influence other communities far away from Portugal and all over Europe. And that's the way that we can create impact. At the same time, and it's obviously, they help us to bring income to the farm that we can apply directly on the farm and grow, or at least try to engage better with the ecosystem.
I think I see like the picture a little bit more broader. That is, I think everyone should be included in the conversations of what the definition of Regenec should be. Certification, let's say, internally for us had, I would say, no impact. In terms of validation, okay, of what we are doing, because as we have a lot of research projects, so we have a lot of data related with all aspects of, let's say, a farming ecosystem, including soil health, biodiversity, above ground, below ground. So internally for us, it was, let's say, more a strategic thing, both, as João said, in marketing. So we, as if it is like in any field of marketing, that is, if you are the pioneer in the marketing, you probably get more success about exploring this new market. At least as with the regenerative organic certification, we can get, let's say, an external proof. So in our case, we didn't change any practice. We increase a little bit the bureaucracy, because certifications always mean a little bit more bureaucracy. But for us, it was a kind of natural certification, because we already did most of the practices and the pillars. It was more, okay, here for the external people. So we have this certification, and also it was a little bit market strategy, because being the first, one of the first in Europe at large scale production, for us also started to open new collaborations to go with our products in the market.
Certainly, if we can influence other projects to follow the same path that we have done, that's also a mission accomplished for us.
What really stuck with me from speaking to João and Diogo was that the certification process didn't change the way that they manage their farm or how they made decisions. But they feel that there's value in having the endorsement in order to reach new markets and obtain an added value for the products that they sell. Like many of the farmers that I know, they are also motivated to set an example and to help their neighbors and their peers around them to reach for a higher standard. Now, I can personally relate to this sentiment because, as anyone knows who manages landscapes and communities, regeneration within property boundaries represents a huge limitation in potential. If the land and the culture around you is severely degraded, the oasis that you try to create can never reach its full potential. And on the other hand, if you can inspire others in your watershed or your biome or your local community and the broader culture to participate in advancing a brighter future, the possibilities are limitless. And João and Diogo really embody this realization. Now, this concept of regeneration is hardly the first standard or concept to be developed into certification. All of us are familiar with organic or biocertification, and that's been around for a long time. And it seems like just a while ago that everyone was talking about organic as the highest of standards. In all of the conversations that I had around this topic, organic certification was mentioned as something that was still valid for certain reasons, but that had been compromised.
Hi, my name is Ana Digon, and I am honored to be the president of the Spanish Association of Regenerative Agriculture. It is officially the Spanish one, although in practice, our scope is really Iberia. So as a bioregion, Spain and Portugal, and also the islands are part of the spaces where we work.
I spoke with Anna at length about why she and her association felt the need to go beyond organic standards and criteria to define a new aspiration for farmers on the Iberian Peninsula.
When we decided to embark on the mission of trying to define regenerative agriculture, it came from a clear demand from the farmers themselves and the collectives, and already seeing the dangers of greenwashing, of others taking on the role of defining. So it's like, well, before others do, we need to do this. So we took that on, and how to do it. When we designed that process in 2022 of involving the key stakeholders and key voices with the farmers leading, and to have all that debate, in the middle of that process, we kind of invented that process and what we thought it would be logical. And we were invited to go to the 5th International Congress of Organic Agriculture in Germany, which happened to be the 50th anniversary of IFOAM as well. So we were there for a few days with all these people from around the world. They went through the history of IFOAM from the beginning. And they gave the first definition of organic agriculture that they had crafted 50 years back, which was organic agriculture is the agriculture that cares for the health of the soil, of the plants, the animals, the people, and the environment as a whole. And when I heard that, I wrote that down. I memorized that because that is exactly, I would sign that for regenerative agriculture. That is the definition of regenerative agriculture. So a debate ensued in that space where we were saying, in Spain, where we come from, organic agriculture doesn't look like that. In many places, it is bare soil monoculture for export that is not using certain toxic chemicals, but that is certainly not looking after the health of soil, plants, animals, the environment, and people as a whole. So how did we get there? What happened if that was the definition 50 years ago, and now we're here? So we went in depth into this analysis in that fora with people who'd been there from the beginning. And what had happened was that at a certain point, they'd had to protocolize it to be able to take it to the European Union and have a standard, and that was then taken down to the countries. So already in the European Union, when you write something down already, you're simplifying something that is complex. And putting words to something that is complexity is always going to be limiting. But then you take it to European Union, where there's a whole bunch of lobbies that are interested or not in this or that happening, and that goes through those filters. And the legality filters, and then it goes down to the countries, where again, there's another set of administrative, legal, and lobby interests and realities happening. And then it comes down to the people, and then it comes down to organizations that actually set that out, and then the person comes to your farm, if they ever come, to have a look at what you're doing. So all of that is what has decaffeinated concept, which was so beautiful. And I said to them there, we all wish that organic agriculture were this, because then we wouldn't have to exist. We wouldn't have to create this organization and do all the work that we do. Unfortunately, the reality is that process happened and it was decaffeinated. So how can we avoid going through that same process with all the work that involves and having that outcome? Let's learn from that and not have that same outcome.
Anna is much more than a criticizer of organic standards. Her work with the Association of Iberian Regenerative Agriculture has done years of work and facilitation to create a principle-based definition of regen ag with the farmers and the practitioners in their network.
It is clearly the farmers who need to lead the conversation. They are the ones who are experimenting every day on their farms with their actions and with their economy, putting their economies on the line to test out and to develop and adapt regenerative techniques to their reality and to their context. So they're the ones who can say what regenerative agriculture is without a doubt. For us, this is totally clear. They are the voices that should lead. And for us as an association, our role is to facilitate those voices coming together and coming to agreements and consensus, knowing that it is a very complex issue and that by defining and by setting out criteria or definitions, you are simplifying something that is complex and you're trying to put it into words, which is why the process itself cannot be simplified and cannot be taken on by a single voice. It should be the collective voice of farmers who are the ones who define. So what we've done for that is that in 2012, we decided to really take the bull by the horn and say, okay, let's do this process of facilitating the conversation amongst pioneering practitioners of regenerative agriculture in our region. Initially, the aim was we wanted to create a map of regenerative farms. This was something that had been a request from many people for many years already. But we realized, of course, you can't just create a map. You need to have criteria to who goes on that map. It's not our friends who go on the map. There needs to be a fair process for people to be able to go on that map. So that was a moment when it was like, right, now we really need to get stuck into this and really facilitate that process. So what we did is we had the invaluable help of an intern from Wageningen who is cease fasting, and she was with us for 6 months. And we designed a process that was participatory for the pioneers in regenerative agriculture in Spain and Portugal to be able to come together and agree. So what we did there is we invited the 10 main organizations in Spain and Portugal, or grassroots organizations who, like us, are serving the collective, the regenerative collective. And then the 10 main technicians who are all specialists in different areas and in different regions of the whole of Iberia, who are the pioneering trainers and advisors and consultants in the scene at the time, and the 25 pioneering farming families who represented a whole array of different regions, productions, realities and contexts, and who were all professionals, professional farmers who live off farming. That is their main economic activity. So, for them, it's really important that it works financially. And also who had been at the time doing regenerative farming for at least 6 years. So not beginners, but people who've gone through those initial stages of, hey, it's all great in the land, then bam, crash, and you have to go through those difficult first years to really be able to develop systems that are actually, genuinely profoundly regenerating and that can be sustained over time. And so those were the people who invited to that first conversation. We developed a proposal based on what was published so far, the science published so far. And all of those people went through all of the proposal in detail. And first with the organizations, the grassroots organizations, by consensus of them, it went on to the technicians. By consensus of them, it went on to the farmers. So they had the final word. And it was an amazing process all the way. And then the final result was sent through to everybody for everyone's approval. So it was a really beautiful process that actually, thinking back, was very well designed and very well executed. And what we came out with there was a set of 7 minimum criteria and a whole list of recommended criteria. And with that, we were able to create and launch the map of regenerative Iberian farms with 80 farms who complied with that criteria. So this process that we developed in 2022, and which is what we're following, is actually defined as not certification, but validation by the practicing community. And what it means is the practicing community sets out its standards and criteria, and it is the practicing community that validates each other, not as a judgment, but as a, we're on this journey together, and you get to a certain point of the journey and you get to be visible as a reference for others, as an inspiration of this is where people can be aiming for. And all the steps of the journey are important and valid. And once you get to a certain point, then you can say that you are really doing this, that you are really regenerating.
As someone who works in farmer community organizing myself, I'm more than partial to insisting that farmers be the ones to create the definition and standards of the growing practices that they want to protect. But in the current moment, in which regen ag has become a buzzword and a marketing ploy, they're certainly not the only ones who are asserting a definition. Remember how Joao and Diogo talked about getting regenerative organic certification, or ROC, often called ROC for short? Well, that's just one of many certifications. In this case, coming from the Regenerative Organic Alliance, which was established in 2017 by a group of farmers, business leaders, and experts in soil health, animal welfare, and social fairness. And so I reached out to a member of their team.
Yeah, so I'm Benjamin Farr, and I am a farmer, but also a designer and builder of ecological systems for farms.
Benjamin was instrumental in helping the team at Monte Silveira navigate the certification process, and as a former organic farmer himself, I talked to him about who should assert these definitions and standards, as well as how the ROA attempts to take on such a complex task.
Yeah, who gets to define regenerative agriculture is, I think it's taking a step back and seeing that we are currently undergoing a great transformation as a culture and as a species. And we're seeing the, capitalist colonial project start to fall apart, if you will. It's starting to collapse at this long or transition or transform, evolve. There's a whole way in which our society works and ways in which we're rewarded. Capitalism often gets confused with economics. People think that, it's like you start talking about anti-capitalism or post-capitalism, and, people get confused with like us going back to a time where we didn't have trade or we didn't have economics or anything. And it's like, no, there's ways to function in society, and it's much older than capitalism. But right now we're seeing the dismemberment of that, really. And so I frame that only because we currently are still in that system, and we're having to transition through it. And in that transition, it's not overnight, it's not 1 year, it's not a couple of years. This is a 500-year project that now is transitioning out. And the new one that comes in is, I think, in this constant conflict of having to function and support the ideas and innovation and understand and grapple with climate and the population while needing to step into this new system. And that new system is one that is focused on regenerating. And so when we look at, regeneration or regenerative, the definition is that which is enlivening something that's been dead, right? It's like bringing back that which has been, damaged. And agriculture in its core is extractive. We harvest, we get a yield. And so the idea that to regenerate that which has been extracted from for so long, right? And so there is this regenerative process. Is that the end outcome? I think resiliency is the outcome that we're really working for, and that there is a process of regeneration. And we often, as you know, and as many people listening hear, that regenerative is part of a indigenous practice. And yet that indigenous practice is not the one that functions in its entirety within the system we're in, meaning that's been colonized. right? And so there's a colonized mindset that needs to be unwoven and reckoned with. And so I think there's like a whole process. And so who defines it is really those that practice, and it becomes nuanced in definition and in language. And people who fight around the definition usually have some other agenda, I think, at play. They usually have some agenda within the system that we're in. And so when we define it and then it doesn't fit our agenda, it's conflictual. And so then we need to like figure out a new and that's why you have all these different organizations and people and certifications coming forth with their definition and to say like, this is what we need to do. In the end, we're all on the same planet. We're all in the same field. We all need to eat. We all need to survive through this. And so, I think the process for me engaging with ROA, which is part of the ROC, the Regenerative Organic Certification, is a nonprofit, the Regenerative Organic Alliance. And my work involving in there was coming from their founding director, Elizabeth Whitlow, who was my organic certifier 20 years ago. And we've stayed in touch since, and we've worked a lot. And she brought me in to help facilitate bioregional educational centers for farmers, for brands, for communities to go on the path of transitioning from this extractive conventional system to one that is regenerative and organic, meaning that we need to get from here to there. And we need to form an alliance to do that. And we see this emerging also in Europe with IARA and lots of other organizations saying we need to form an alliance. We need to bring everyone's voice to the table and understand how to work through this. So I came in mainly as a facilitator because I also have, through that permaculture experience I have and leading courses and whatnot, I had a lot of understanding of how to facilitate a group and have everyone's voice being heard. And because it's complex when you come from a farming background to make it work in this industrial system and you're coming in with more small scale that's focused on regenerative, focused on organic, when our system doesn't reward us for that. And so to really, these are you could say it's the rebel alliance of our time, or like these pioneering species, but it's ancient. It's an ancient practice. So it's a very dynamic engagement. And I think the one thing with ROC that is unique is it looks also at the social and animal welfare components, which you have to look at the whole system. And I think that's where a lot of agriculture needs to go, is looking at the whole system rather than it getting siloed into these components so much.
Tell me about the utility of defining and certifying a concept which is essentially a journey, right? You don't finish regeneration. It's something that is a lifelong pursuit and that is a collaboration with the living entities in the space that you manage. So where is the utility in certifying something like this? Is it for accessing new markets? Is it just legitimizing the efforts of the people involved?
Yeah, so the utility of the certification particularly is that participation in the system, participation within the marketplace, participation within the kind of producer consumer or producer co-producer relationship, and developing at that scale a sense of trust, when in reality we would like to trust each other. It's part of our human nature, right? It's like you're farming, okay, I trust you're doing it well, I'm going to eat this food. I feel like this honey I can trust that it's good, it's coming from clean fields, it's coming, and what I'm putting in my mouth is good. That's not the case of our system. We know a lot of our food is not good food. It's not medicine as it should be. It's poisoned and it makes us sick. It inflames our gut. It gives us cancer, develops allergies, develops all these things. So the consumer now needs to look at the label and see if it's organic, see if it's glyphosate free, see how it's being grown. And so then we see it on labels everywhere. There's regenerative. And so then you have to say, okay, what's then the consumer who doesn't know has to then understand what that definition is and what does that mean. And that's where the complexity of who defines, as we were just speaking about, comes into place. And then who can you trust? And if we're allowing, what we're allowing in that. So the certification utility is basically saying, okay, here's our baseline of what we are defining it as. So if you say we're organic, and as we saw with the organic movement, it got co-opted, especially, I'm coming from the States, but also looking at the world system, and, it became industrial organic. And that's kind of getting into the origins of how regenerative organic was founded. But the utility specifically is to drive demand within the marketplace for this practice, so that when that demand is present, it then requires farmers to meet that demand. And then those farmers would then have to be growing in that way to supply that brand who's certified the certified products. So that's it creates this flywheel of driving demand to increase supply, which then increases transition towards this practice. Because the farmer's not if he doesn't have a marketplace for it, he's like, okay, what's the reason for doing this?
I want to go into one more perspective here, because it's the one that we at Climate Farmers have built through our own attempt at creating a system that helps to measure the journey and bring clarity to the question of which farms are on a regenerative path. Now, though we didn't create a certification, we did build a monitoring, reporting, and verification system, MRV for short.
Yeah, I'm Phil Fernandez, and I work for a company called and Terra Madre basically took over the carbon business that was developed by Climate Farmers. And I continue to collaborate with Climate Farmers on what we're calling the agro ecosystem MRV, where we're measuring the outcomes of regenerative agriculture.
Now, even though, like he mentioned, Phil moved to work with another company called Terra Madre when Climate Farmers discontinued their carbon credit program, he continues to coordinate the MRV program and advises on the educational material that I'm building for the Academy. And I caught up with him to talk about the process that he led almost 2 years ago now, and which I was involved in too, to create our system of accompanying farmers in their transition journeys and taking a myriad of measurements in order to make objective and scientific claims on how they are progressing in a variety of metrics. First, Phil addresses the central question of who does and who should assert a definition that guides the monitoring process, because without a definition, what guides the data collection?
The question, I guess, is who is defining regenerative agriculture? And then a related question, who should be defining regenerative agriculture? So there have been some interesting initiatives by different social economic sectors. There's corporate associations such as the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. They have developed a very high-level framework, which is interesting. There have also been NGOs that have developed frameworks, and there also, fortunately, have been farmer associations, such as the European Alliance for Regenerative Agriculture, who have developed a very interesting methodology. To be useful and to be scaled and applied across the board, I think all these groups have to come together and reach a consensus on what regenerative agriculture is, because the framework has to be agreed on by all, it has to be accurate, and it has to be reliable. So to do that, we need to involve everyone in this process. I think the good news is that there is quite a bit of consensus about what regenerative agriculture is. There's some different nuances, maybe for specific indicators. There's a debate over what metrics are the best to measure those indicators. But overall, I think everyone agrees, corporations, farmers, supply chain actors, that we should be looking at climate, we should be looking at soil, water, biodiversity, and social impact. So high level, there is this consensus. And then there is, like I said, debate over what indicators do we use to determine progress in those different impact areas. I think people refer to it as a taxonomy. So that's where the real challenge is. How can we identify those indicators that are most accurate, most reliable, and that can be measured at the lowest possible cost?
In the end, who defines regenerative agriculture and what the definition is just a small part of the actual issue of trying to pin down something as complex as a journey in stewarding the land, the business, and the people who produce our food, fuel, and fiber, and other biological resources. There are so many other perspectives, though, that deserve mention, as well as some that I won't get to in this conversation. Online, I've seen people in organizations who focus on soil health as the biggest motivation and justification for definitions and certifications. Similarly with climate management, by needing to minimize greenhouse gases or sequester carbon, reduce methane, and cool the planet. There's also the camp that waves the flag for agroecology, which has so much in common with the assertions of the Regen Ag camp, but has a much longer and academic definition that merges into political assertions and land access movements. Meanwhile, I've also seen massive ag and chemical industry actors like Bayer Monsanto or Syngenta, Nestle, Unilever, Danone, and others either roll out Regen Ag definitions and programs or even use the term to attach themselves to the movement and sell products. Now, though I'm going to hold back on making assertions about the participation of those players in this space until a representative from one of the companies accepts my invitation to an interview, you can also imagine the outcry and the backlash from people who see them and their products as the primary reason for distinguishing certifications and why those are necessary in the first place. There's also a very valuable and often overlooked perspective from indigenous people or peasant farmers and traditional farming groups that decry the co-opting of practices, farming philosophies, and management cultures that have existed for far longer than any of the terms and phrases that I've mentioned so far. Many of them claim that labels like Regen Ag have encompassed a whole range of ideas from these groups that effectively erase their ownership and their histories as the originators. For a lot of reasons, I'm going to hold back from making that case until I can speak with someone who represents those voices, but it's worth mentioning just how broad this conversation can go. Now, the central issue of definitions and certifications, or even monitoring, come from a disconnect that we haven't even discussed yet. And that's the fact that almost all of us are disconnected from our sources of sustenance. It wasn't long ago at all that most people either played a role in producing their own food or knew people in their community who did. As a result, there was absolutely no reason to assert that your food source was grown or cared for in one way or another because you either did it yourself or you knew the people who did. And as supply chains grew and expanded around the globe and were consolidated by companies motivated for profit, nearly all of us have lost touch with the relationships that gave us access to the harvest of the earth. And I think that certifications and packaging stickers are a really weak proxy for these missing relationships. And even as someone who works in this sector and has a decent understanding of how it's developed and enforced, I myself often either don't care or don't trust the labels on the products in the store. And while I'm not at all saying that we should stop caring about how our food is produced, I am saying that we shouldn't forget to work towards rebuilding these relationships with the land and the people that keep us fed and nourished, and that stickers and labels are not going to replace that relationship. The question of who should define Regen Ag and what the definition should be is really just scratching at the surface of this topic, however. In the next deep dive episode, though, we're going to go a whole lot deeper into the how of this matter. We're going to come back and speak with many of these same guests from this episode, as well as some new voices, who are going to help to shed light on the practical side of measuring a journey of regeneration. What gets measured and what gets left out? What tools and technology can give the most accurate data? What constraints need to be considered when measuring something that is essentially infinite? What timelines need to be considered when accompanying an endless journey? And in the end, what do we do with all of this data? Well, that wraps up this week's episode. But before you go, I want to invite you to participate in the conversations around the topics that we explored just now. Though we highlighted a few different perspectives, there's so much more to discuss. So if you know someone who would benefit from listening to this episode, be sure to share it with them. The best way to connect with us and the wider community is through the Climate Farmers community. Now, if you're an active farmer anywhere in Europe, you can join the community for free through our website at climatefarmers.org. We also have a growing list of resources to help farmers successfully transition to regenerative management on our resource page, where you'll find a free water management guide, the Academy's learning ecosystem, farmer profiles on our members map, coach matching, and much more. For everyone else, you can participate by reaching out to us on LinkedIn or Instagram, either on the Climate Farmers accounts or with me directly. I regularly invite collaborators to join me on steering and development calls for these episodes, so just drop me a line. Until next time, just remember, it takes everybody, no matter their abilities, experience, or skill set, to build a regenerative future. What will your contribution be?